Good afternoon to everybody. Muy buenas tardes. Thank you for being here today in Instituto Cervantes in Sydney. We are responsible for promoting Spanish language and Hispanic culture in Australia and New Zealand as a whole. It's a lot to cover. Today we're here in Instituto Cervantes of Sydney, and with your permission, I would like to give the acknowledgement of country. I begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather here today. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. We are here today in Instituto Cervantes in Sydney, in this case with wonderful colleagues of ours with whom we've worked before. It's a wonderful title. I did not come up with it. My friend here gave us the suggestion. It's not just about words. We're here to talk about something that is very crucial to us in Instituto Cervantes, to promote Spanish literature, Spanish speaking from any Spanish-speaking country authors, which is translation. We are very lucky to have here today a long-lasting friend and long-lasting collaborator of Instituto Cervantes, Lilit Thwaites, and it's a very honorable occasion as well, because we also have here today Daniel Hahn. Lilit Thwaites is an award-winning Australian literacy translation, adjunct professor in the contemporary Spanish literature at Iturbe University in Melbourne, and the current president of Australian Association for Literary Translation. Her books, translations include bestselling The Librarian of Auschwitz, Australian Connection, and two futuristic novels by Rosa Montero, amongst many other. In 2016, she received Spain's Cross of the Order of Civil Merit for her promotion of Spanish literature and cultures in Australia. There's more information in the flyer in the program of this event. Also, we are very lucky and honored to have here today with us Daniel Hahn, who is the award-winning writer, editor, and translator with about 100 books to his name. Recent books include Catching Fire, a translation diary, translations of work by Gonzalo Taveras and Juan Jose Millas. He is a past chair of the Society of Authors, the Writers' Union in the UK, and the Translators Association, and serves on the board of a number of organizations working with literature, literacy, and free expression. He is one of the editors of the Ultimate Book Guide, a series of reading guides for children and teenagers, and the author of Happiness is a Watermelon on Your Head, a picture book for children, amongst many others. Once again, also a more detailed biography in the documentary flyer of this wonderful event. What is most important is what is to become, so all introductions are best when they're made short. So I pass the floor to my esteemed colleague Lilit, who will be interviewing and having a fluent conversation with Daniel Hahn. Once again, thank you both of you for being here today in Instituto Cervantes.
Danny and I met about 2014, I think, at the London Book Fair or something like that. And I was intimidated already back then. Probably only had 80 books translated at that stage, but anyway.
I'm very frightening, as you can, I'm sure you can tell already. Absolutely terrifying.
And the thing that really struck me already then was what a wonderful conversationalist he was, and how much he has, what he knows about, and not just translating, but he himself is an author of all sorts of both fiction and non-fiction, and we will talk a little bit about this book at some stage. And also one of these people who has a finger in every possible pie connected in any way with translation literature, in his case from both Spanish-speaking countries and French and Portuguese. So, question, 3 languages, how did you come by them?
Hello, good evening. It's very nice to be here. I should say I had a brief pang feeling like I shouldn't be here because one of the first things I saw when I walked into this room was on the shelf just behind the lady over there was a copy of the book that I'm supposed to be sitting at my laptop translating now. So I'm now slightly conscious that everything we do is not what I'm meant to be doing because I have a deadline and it is just behind.
And I might add, this is supposed to be his holiday.
And was sort of, only sort of. I translate mostly from Spanish and Portuguese. I do a bit of French, as Lilit said, but Spanish and Portuguese are the two I do most. But they're both languages which I have through my parents. My father was born in Argentina, he's from Buenos Aires. My mother is born in Brazil, in Rio. I've only ever spoken English to my parents. My parents met in London. English was their common language, so English was the language I grew up with. But both of those languages were around all the time. I mean, as Lilit knows, I don't speak Spanish comfortably or willingly.
You never speaks
No,
to me.
well, that's what I mean. You did try. I think the answer was no, not. You can speak to me in Spanish. I'm very happy for you to speak to me in Spanish. But that's the thing because I translate into English. English is the language I can make things with. I can speak. My spoken English is acceptable. I hope. But I consume the others. I'm used to being surrounded by the others. I grew up, as I say, with parents who spoke these other languages and with aunts and uncles and cousins from Brazil and that kind of thing. And so those two other languages are quite sort of deep in my bones, I think. But it's always been quite a passive thing. My French, I learned French at school, and so my French is much less good in the sense that it's, I have high school French. I translate much less, and I translate much less complicated things from French, much less sophisticated things. But Portuguese and Spanish, I have this, with both of them to slightly different degrees, slightly odd relationship in which I am a very, as it were, fluent consumer of them. I read very comfortably, I hear them, understand them very comfortably, but I get slightly nervous if I have to produce them.
I meant to ask at the beginning, among you, how many of you are either actual translators or budding or aspiring translators? Yeah, you. Yeah. Okay, so we will focus a bit on that. So I think Danny and I had a conversation like this in Melbourne last week, so we're sort of continuing a bit, and I have to keep remembering that you weren't there. So apologies if something doesn't quite make sense.
So as we were saying, yes,
Yes, exactly.
and another thing, yeah,
And that's for the Queen.
yeah.
Yes. Anyway, so what's most important when you're translating is clearly the language you're translating into.
The language I'm translating into is the what feels like the skill I have. There are huge numbers of people who have a certain degree of comfort in 2 languages or 3 languages. Someone, I can't remember who it was that said, like, knowing 2 languages makes you a translator in the same way that having 2 hands makes you a pianist. Like, of course, that helps as a starting point, but actually there are other things that are required, not just having these particular things. And so having this other language, the source language, in my case, Portuguese or Spanish, that is an important thing, but actually that's not the thing that makes me able to do the job. The thing that makes me able to do the job is some ability to work English in a particular way, or in many different ways, because every book and every voice and every character, every style is going to be different. And the ability to do things that are supple and flexible and quite nimble and quite creative sometimes with the language which it is my job to, which is my working tool.
So you didn't start out thinking, I'm going to be a literary translator. What were your original idea about, this is what I'm going to be?
I mean, probably fortunately had absolutely no idea, which was probably easier once upon a time than it is now, I think. I did an English literature degree in the UK, because of the reading. That was mostly what I was going to be doing. and I started. I think it was, in retrospect, it was quite obvious that I was going to end up doing something a little bit like this, because I did a bit of work for publishers and a bit of writing and a bit of working in a bookshop and all. I did all the things that were kind of orbiting around this. Very little bit of translation, but not very much. But I was in this sort of area. Now, when I look back on it, and I go, well, actually, I was a person who was interested in reading and interested in writing and happened to have access to these languages. I shouldn't really be surprised that this is the thing that I ended up doing. But at the time, it was sort of an accidental thing. I was doing vaguely sort of book publishing adjacent things. And I was asked to take on a translation job, and I said yes, which may or not have been a good idea. I feel like I'm still weighing up whether this was a sensible thing to have said. But it wasn't a plan, but it certainly looks like a plan in retrospect.
Yeah. So, how important for you then is having the background knowledge to the culture and of the language that you're translating from, the culture, the socio-historical, whatever, that sort of knowledge, is that?
I mean, I do a lot of work with early career translators and teaching people and mentoring and stuff, and I always tell them it's absolutely essential to know the culture they're translating from. I also am mostly lying when I say that. So I saw you were nodding when I said that, but you have to disagree now. Because actually one of the things that is, if you work with a language like Spanish, if you work with a language like Portuguese, Spanish is not a language which has one culture. There is not one kind of food and kind of dress and set of festivals that spans the Spanish-speaking world.
Or vocabulary.
Or indeed vocabulary. So I translate from Spanish, Portuguese, and French, which means I translate potentially from 35 or 40 countries, some of which I know quite well. When I translate a book that is by a writer from Rio, that is set in Rio, I feel like I'm more likely to know the context and that sort of thing. But the writer I've translated the most is a writer from Angola, which is a country I've never yet been to. I've translated 10 books, I think, from Angola. And it's very different, I think, from translating from a language where if you translate from Korean, if you translate from Greek, if you translate from Slovenian, if you translate from Czech, it is, of course, there will always be diaspora communities and maybe kind of a bit of spilling across borders, but for the most part, we're talking about, 10 million Greek speakers, most of them in Greece, the ones not in Greece, quite a lot in Melbourne, a few in the UK, US, and so forth. Spanish doesn't work like that. And so I've translated work by Mexicans and Guatemalans and Argentines and Chileans and Spaniards, and I'm about to do my first Peruvian book, and I've never been to Peru. Doing a Colombian book at the moment. And what that requires is research, and what it requires is Google, and Google Earth, Google Street View, which is the best thing. And it requires quite a lot of lying, and it requires
French.
Sort of faking it and asking the right people, and often asking the author. A lot of the time I'm sending messages to the author saying, I don't really know, what is this thing these people are eating? I've Googled it. I Google it and I keep getting pictures of a car. It can't be a car. What is it? And that is one of the things that's also, it's a challenge, but it's also partly a pleasure of the job, is discovering this kind of almost endlessly expanding horizons of these languages where, like I say, my first Peruvian book is going to be, and never having been to Peru, is also going to be a huge learning experience for me. And I know which Peruvian friend I'm going to be asking to help me. I haven't told her this yet. And I'm assuming the author is going to answer my questions. I'm assuming that Google will. And also, yes, Peru?
Peru.
Excellent. I have 2 Peruvian friends now. I have a very new Peruvian friend, but it's absolutely game for helping out. Thank you very much.
Okay, so modus operandi. We had this discussion in Melbourne, and we discovered that we approach translation completely differently. I don't know that I could do it your way, and you probably would.
I think you probably do it the right way. I think your way is probably more
It's
sensible.
the right way, but anyway. So your modus is what?
I hate first drafts. First drafts are very boring, but I love editing. I love getting from a bad draft to a good draft, and so I do my first draft as fast as absolutely humanly possible. And what I mean by that is when I'm doing a first draft, and as indeed I am at the moment of a book, I'll do 5,000 or 6,000 words a day. It will be really just unspeakably awful. It will be impossible to read. I won't look anything up. I won't solve any problems. I will leave words in the original. So it's completely impossible to read. Every paragraph will have 5 or 6 words that are still in the other language. They'll have slashes between options and notes to myself and asterisks and question marks and footnotes. Absolutely all kinds of nonsense. Just rubbish. But something. And so I'll very quickly reach the point where there is something, and I can then do the thing which is quite fun, which is turn this thing into a thing that has a voice and a thing that has a rhythm and a thing that has character and that moves like a piece of writing that I like. I will also, on the whole, and this is the thing that upsets people.
This is the bit that I think that's where it's
where possible, I start translating a book without having read it first. So I will open it on the first page and start doing that first draft and discover the book in the first draft. Like I said, that first draft is very, very far from what's going to be the translation. But the reading of the book and doing the first draft for me is often that same stage. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes I have read the book already for some other reason. Sometimes I'm the person who pitched the book to a publisher and therefore, obviously, it's a book I know quite well. But where possible, I will do my discovering of the book. The first discovery of the book will happen in that first draft. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that I'm lazy, but I'm not going to say that. It's also, it is one of the things that rewards me for the first draft, which I don't like very much, that what I get is I get the reading experience. It's the thing that keeps me working fast, because I am turning the pages in the same way I read it. What I'm trying to get through to find out, is she going to die at the end? Who's going to win? I'm reading for plot and for voice and carriage and all those things that we read fiction for, particularly. And that is the thing that also keeps me going when I'm doing this really fast first draft. I also think that there's something about that experience of reading a book for the first time that is never going to be replicated. I can think of a lot of books that I've read many, many times, and certainly everything I've translated I've read many times. And there are some books that continue to be incredibly rewarding, and some books get better and better the more you read them. But I think even those books, there's a particular kind of electricity you get in that first experience of when you're really discovering the story, the voice, the characters. What is this book? The book's explaining to you how to read it. That's the thing that I think can't be, doesn't get replicated when you read it for a second, third, fourth, fifth time. And so that sort of excitement is also the thing that infuses the experience of doing first drafts and makes me willing to do the first draft at all, because otherwise I would just. You can't start with the second draft. This is the annoying thing. You can't just go, I'm not going to do a first draft of this. I'm going to go straight into the second draft of this book. Though I've co-translated quite a lot of books with friends, and we always work in different ways. But I do have one friend who really likes first drafts and doesn't like anything else. And so we're like, perfect marriage now. It's absolutely, couldn't be a better arrangement.
Now that makes me actually interested in your reading generally. So when you're just reading for pleasure, in English, let's say, do you find that your reading is sort of corrupted because you're reading and thinking, this is an interesting, I wonder how you translate, or can you really read for pleasure?
I can in English. A lot of my reading is for one kind of work or other. But I'm also very lucky that I can often choose what I'm going to have to read for work. And therefore I can engineer work pretexts to read things that I want to read. And so if there's a book that I very much want to read for myself because I'm excited about the existence of this thing, I can usually find a work pretext to read it. My experience of it is basically reading for pleasure, though I always, whatever I'm reading, I read with a pencil or a pen in my hand and I scribble, expletives in the margin or questions in the margin or whatever. It is slightly different when I'm reading in another language, not because it's that much harder, but because there is a bit of me which is doing what a translator does. There's a bit of me which is going, that's an interesting challenge. But I think that's also quite, I don't think that's a bad thing. That's not a thing that in any way spoils it for me. That's a thing that in some ways kind of...
It's...
Yeah, do you have that? Do you kind of feel like sometimes when you're reading something in Spanish, the bit of your brain that's going, there's something in this.
Yes.
That's also part of...
Yeah.
That's part of being excited about what this book is doing, right?
Yeah. Okay, so you've done your quick first draft, and then you actually start the series in a sense, the actual. So, on average, how many drafts do you end up with? Actually, we'll get to this in a minute. For people who are translators or are interested in the process, this is a terrific book. We'll get to it in a minute.
Yeah, we can talk about what that is. It's very odd book. I'll do this first draft, which is terrible. I will then go through and fill in some gaps. I will look up the words. It's usually not words that sometimes there are words I don't know, but it's more often words that I don't know what to do with yet. So I will have some, and I'm not going to stop and think about it. I'm just going to leave the word in Spanish and keep moving and come back to it. So I will look things up. I will do the research. I will, look at Google Street View quite a lot. I will look at pictures of things and figure out Latin names of plants and all that stuff we do. And make a few decisions, and then it's just a matter of reading from the beginning to the end, and then reading from the beginning to the end, and there'll be several iterations of 3 or 4 usually, I'd say, iterations of reading, doing that kind of whole surface of the book from one end to the other. It varies a little bit from book to book or project to project, and it's always slightly less precise than it would have been, let's say, pre-computers, in the sense that I don't always have a kind of discrete gap between one draft and another. I love to print things out, but I try to restrain myself from printing out every single draft. And so I might, do a whole draft, but then I'll look at that bit again, and then I'll look at the end again, or maybe I'll look at all the bits that are narrated by one character or whatever. So it isn't necessarily... Also, there's normally one Word document in my laptop, which kind of evolves, but it's not quite as kind of tidy as I will do one draft, and then I will mark it up, and then I will do draft 2. So it's probably 3 or 4 kind of full reads from end to end, but there's also, it's much blurrier. I have friends who think much more tidily about this and say, I do 5 drafts. As though that would,
Just the way it would.
Yeah.
All right, so you've done your final draft, let's say, the one you're going to submit. In the process, you've come across some factual errors in the original. What do you do about them?
It depends slightly on the nature of the error. Of course, none of my writers ever make mistakes. They're being recorded. You're great. We love you. So very occasionally someone will make a mistake, and sometimes it's a factual mistake in the sense of they will put the wrong date when something happened. Sometimes there are things that are kind of editorial mistakes in the sense that there is an inconsistency in the plot. It does happen because the book hasn't been edited very well to begin with, that a character, dies in chapter 7 and then they're having lunch on chapter 8, and this is not supposed to, they're not a ghost, this is just someone who's, moved around the scenes and then forgot that one of the characters is dead. When it's a very tiny thing, I will usually just change it myself. When it's something that requires more drastic action, I will usually talk to the author. Sometimes it goes to the publisher, and then the publisher and I will discuss it with the author. But often the authors I work with are involved to sometimes quite considerable degree with the translation. And so I will drop them a note and say, "You idiot, this person died in chapter 7, what's wrong with you?" Amateurs. And sometimes suggest a change. And also, if it is done not in that tone, they usually like to.
I'm grateful
They're
because there'll
usually-
be another edition of the original.
Yeah, and because next year it's going to be translated into French, and then they will know to fix that kind of thing. And that does also happen that when a book has been translated into other languages before English. I mean, I did a Brazilian book recently, and I was in touch with the author, and I was about to send him a draft, and he said, "Before you do that, I'm going to forward you my entire correspondence with my French translator." Because the French translator had picked up on lots of things, some of which I had spotted, some of which I hadn't. They had talked about some little editorial changes. The French translator suggested, adding a line, taking out a line. And actually, we were able to benefit from the fact that even though this book hadn't really had a significant amount of editorial attention in its original publication, it had done in France, which is also quite unusual. But we could then benefit from that. We could take advantage of some of those things in the English language translation.
Oh, okay. Disagreements with your editor.
Again, they never have.
Were they to?
I mean, I
Nice
can speculate.
Yes.
What must it be like to have an annoying editor? Genuinely, it happens very rarely, and I am genuinely very lucky in my editors. I think I can think of a couple of books that I think got worse than the editorial process, but I've done a lot of books, and a couple of them is a very, very small percentage. But it's partly to do with the spirit in which one enters that engagement, I think. First of all, I always assume that the work is going to be edited. I never send something in thinking this is now absolutely crystallized and take your hand off my commas, you're not allowed to touch anything. I assume that everything is still a little bit malleable at the point at which I send it in. And I work with editors who I think are also working in the spirit, which is very positive and collegial. And for the most part, the edit consists of the editor will be marking up the manuscript or whatever. But in the spirit in which that is done is, here are some things that I have noticed in my experience of reading a book. Do with that information what you like.
Oh.
So they're not saying, I am imposing this restructuring of the sentence, or I'm imposing this repunctuation or whatever. They're saying, it's useful for you to know that I found this sentence quite hard to follow. If you want to say, well, screw you, I don't care, I think it's perfectly good, then that is absolutely your problem. But on the whole, I think, as translators and most writers, those of us who are, and I'm sure I get difficult sometimes, but I think most of us on the whole, if we're given feedback that we understand and that it's from someone we trust and that actually helps us to make something better, it would be really perverse to go, all the people who've read this think this sentence doesn't make sense, but I don't care.
It's going in that way.
It's going. That would be. I think that'd be a really perverse way to think about what essentially is an enormous piece of luck that you get someone who will read this thing before like 5,000 people are spending money on it, and this person will read it. They will articulate their experience of reading it in a way that is really useful. And if you choose to resist, then this is absolutely your problem. What I find on the whole is I will get maybe 60% of the things an editor marks on a manuscript I will accept. 65%, I don't know. 65%, let's say. There are probably 10%, maybe 15% where I absolutely say, no, I actually think this is good. And the remaining 20 or 25% will be things where I will look at the editor's marks and I'll go, I don't really like the suggestion, but I can see the problem they've identified. So I completely understand that this really isn't a very felicitous bit of phrasing or a very clear way of expressing something, or, this joke is not quite as funny as it could be. I don't think their alternative is quite right, but
Or you might come up with it.
I will try. I will
Yeah.
find. I will make a change to solve the problem that they have raised, even if the change isn't the change they suggested.
Yeah.
There are very, very few places where I will, like I say, maybe 10-15%, where I will look at it and go, actually, I want you to leave it exactly as it is. It also depends, it varies editor to editor. I'm lucky to have had quite a few editors with whom I've worked for many, many books, and I assume that like the default thing is they're going to be right and I'm going to be wrong. It's a thing one has to slowly teach oneself. It doesn't come naturally to me. Doing my best.
All right, I want to come to this book because the clock ticks and I'm very aware of it. Do you want to say something about it yourself? And then I'm going to ask Daniel to read an excerpt from it.
Sure.
Because it's actually, I've having got my hands on it, I've now worked my way through it and I find it intriguing as a translator. But anyway, talk about it.
Sure. So about 3 years ago, I was approached by a publisher I'd worked with quite a lot, Charco Press, who do Latin American fiction. They're based in the UK. And we were talking about doing a new book together, and we were going to set off on a translation of a book by Lilit Thwaites, Chilean writer, really great, incredibly difficult to translate Chilean writer. And I am always trying to find ways of getting people who haven't thought about translation very much to think about translation, finding places where I can kind of have those conversations. And so I write about translation quite a lot, but I write about it for like newspapers and things. I'm not an academic, and I'm not someone who's written for academic presses, but if I write about translation, it'll be for the New York Times or the Guardian or somewhere where it'll be introducing it to people for whom it is a relatively new subject. And what I proposed to Charco when I was setting out to do the Lilit Thwaites book was something I'd done a couple of times before, which was to keep a blog sort of following the process of translating this novel. And I asked them basically if I kept a blog, would they post it on their website, the publisher's website, over the course of the 3 or so months I was going to be working on this book. And the idea was to let people see the process, to be quite concrete about it, and not to write about translation in a very abstract way, but to write about issues I came across in quite a concrete way. Not to write about like what it feels like to be a translator and what the life of a translator is like and how much people should pay us and those things, but really like the first post was, so I'm going to translate this book by Lilit Thwaites. I wonder what it's like. And then the last post 3 months later was, well, I'm clicking send now, it's ready to go to the publishers. And along the way, I described challenges with the title and with the friction between the languages and the gender and the pronouns, and just really quite concrete things, and looked at and shared slightly humiliatingly, this is a bit of my first draft, and this is, it's quite good for the ego, I have to say. So I wrote this entire blog over the course of a few months, and at the end of the process, when I had delivered the book, Catalina, the editor at Charco Press, called and said, so are we going to publish this blog as a book now? To which I said, no, obviously. It's a really weird idea. But after some haggling, she won. And we agreed to publish it as a book. We ended up doing something which was quite fun in some respects, which was, we published on the same day as the Lilit Thwaites novel I translated. They have sort of matching covers. And we kind of launched them into the world together. So we have Lilit novel in my translation and sort of the making of. And actually this book there's quite a long introduction, which is a kind of general thoughts about translation. And there is an afterword, which is 3 pages long, but everything else is almost verbatim as it appears in the blog. I did very, very little editorial work to it. So it's a little bit sort of, rough and ready. But it's been really interesting to see the reaction to it, because many of my translator friends, people who know about translation, interested in translation, have read it because it's, I assume they will be interested. But the readership has been in some ways much more interesting than that because it was written for people who were not. It was written for civilians rather than professionals. One of the things that I've come across a lot is people saying, translators saying, "Oh, I bought this for my boyfriend, so he understands what I've been talking about all this time." People have been using it to kind of explain their job to other people, and so it's been read. And it's being used to teach translation in various university courses, but also it's had press in quite mainstream places.
Yes.
And so it's this slightly funny. I'm beginning to come to terms with the existence of this book now, but it's taken a while. But it is this attempt to do something which is quite concrete and quite nerdy in some respects. There was a lot of writing about punctuation. There was a lot of writing about the cadences of a sentence. There's a lot of writing about why this word rather than that word.
But done in a very readable way, in a way that people who read it, who aren't translators, actually makes them stop and think about their own way of reading and so, yeah.
I think that's the hope, because I always intended it to be not. I mean, I have a sense, like, most of my friends, my old friends, are not translators, but I also have a sense of what would make them laugh, or how much I need to explain. I also think
this is exactly what I always think. I mean,
there's quite a lot of.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most common reactions I got from translator friends. I don't think any of my translator friends read it and learned anything new. That's not how it works. But a lot of people read it and went, "Oh, I'm so relieved."
I'm not the only one.
Yeah, or even worse. Your first drafts are even worse than my first drafts. You found all these things difficult. That felt like my that sort of penance. I feel like my act of my gift to the community.
Okay,
is the self-abasement in which I tell you how difficult I find this.
Do it. Read a little sample.
Have
we got time? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. The bit that I was going to read is so it's the moment when, having said I do that first draft really quickly, I look things up, and then the next stage is when I go into reading it all the way through. This is the moment, this is 30th of March is the entry, and it's the moment when I've just finished all the looking up. 30th of March. Hallelujah. This feels like progress. I've looked up most of the things I needed to look up, and I've made a few small choices. There are still a lot missing, and many, many edits ahead. But at least the manuscript now actually looks like the draft of a novel, and no longer like an explosion in a multilingual nonsense factory. So, well, that's something. A few of the things I have been reminded of in the last few days. 1. If I'm honest, sometimes when choosing between a couple of options for a word, one of the criteria that plays a part is simply which word I like the most. Today I had one of those rare cases where I was struggling because basically I really like both alternatives. So is the narrator's approach going to be furtive or stealthy? This language spoils me sometimes. I also like the word baleful enough that I found myself trying quite hard to crowbar it into a sentence where it probably doesn't belong. Great though, isn't it? 2. Bread is for a seemingly simple noun surprisingly hard to translate. 3. English does great verbs. I just took a phrase which in Spanish was something like I pulled up with great and abrupt strength and translated it as I yanked. Other words continue frustratingly to non-exist, however. I need an adjective to describe someone who is waiting for something, but which isn't waiting, which doesn't give any indication as to whether they think the thing they await will be good, expectant, or bad, apprehensive. If you have any suggestions, I'll be here sitting waitingly. 4. Prepositions are really annoying. 5. We usually rely on context to tell us which of 2 or more possible meanings is the most likely. So while I learned this week, for example, that the word palo not only means stick, of course, but is also used specifically in Chile to refer to, the writer was Chilean, I should say, to refer to a million pesos. Nonetheless, going on probability, the scene in which a character is badly beaten with a palo almost certainly intends the first meaning. She is not, I'm fairly confident, being viciously assaulted with large wads of banknotes. But a few new things I have learned. One, that point I just made about being able to deduce meanings from context doesn't always work if you have a writer who actively enjoys using words in unlikely ways. This is and will continue to be a problem. There are even 2 instances of words in this book which, if it were any other writer, I'd think they were typos for other similar but much more obvious words. But here, maddeningly, I can't be sure. More on this to come, I suspect. 2. Alero is the Spanish for eaves. Another lovely new word to forget before the week is up. 3. Car accidents seem to be dealt with differently in Chile in legal terms. It has something to do with judges, and I haven't grasped this entirely yet, still pending further investigation. 4. The Brazilian translation of this book, which I mentioned a few days ago, includes 2 translators' footnotes. One of them to explain what a fletista is, as per my February 1st entry, and one to gloss the wordplay between wrist and doll, my entry on March the 14th. I have unreasonably strong feelings about using footnotes, but wonder whether this is a book in which I should maybe just get over myself. I used a couple of them in my very first book translation about 1,000 years ago, and have managed to avoid them since, but I could, I suppose, make an exception. There is a footnote here. I am slightly compromised, though. I once casually remarked to an author that I consider the footnote in the translated novel to be an admission of defeat. That author then quoted me saying exactly this in one of his books, and that book in question appears in English this summer. Never say things to authors. And 5, I've learned that there are several more or less singable English translations of the Internationale, and I don't really love any of them. Tomorrow, I start reading. Having put all the various slippery bits back into the novel and sewn it up again, now is the stage at which I find out if the patient still has a pulse. I'll let you know. End of March 30th.
Delightful. I think maybe we go to a few questions, and then if there's any more time, I'll ask perhaps about what are the new challenges confronting translators now?
Nothing, it's all terribly easy.
Yeah.
It's all going to be fine.
It's all
going
going
to be fine.
computer generated, and our job will.
We'll finally get that holiday we were promised. Yeah.
Okay, questions. Okay.
What do you like about his translation, and what do you dislike about his translation?
Oh, I dislike absolutely nothing about his translation.
No?
I read some of her translations as well. They're also very good. Aren't we great? I mean, I think we're both excellent, aren't we? You agree, don't you?
No question. No, I think the thing that really, and it was the first question one of the first questions I asked Danny last week,
Yes.
was this business of, so how do you approach it? Because I always read the whole novel first, because there are certain things that I want to know before I start, tone and narrator and so on. So when he said, well, I actually never do, unless I've had to read it for other reasons, it absolutely floored me. And so I'm now going to look at his translations, and having read this book, I'm now going to look at his translations in a different way. But no,
Quite alarming.
there are some. I mean, the trouble is, even with your own translation, and those of you who are translators know, you can look at a book you translated that came out last year, and you think, there's got to be a better way of saying it. Or
Really?
it is absolutely. Yeah, I think.
Well, when I'm doing a reading at like a public, if I'm reading at a festival or something, I almost always read with a pen in my hand, because I'm still tweaking things and fixing things. If you'd had a copy of the thing I just read now and were following it along, you would have noticed I changed a few bits, because there was a little repetition of a word which I don't like very much. and there was a little thing that was slightly influenced. There are a few things that weren't quite right, and I find myself always doing that. But I relatively recently, the second book I ever translated, which is 17 years ago, has just been reissued a few months ago by a publisher in the UK, and they gave me, they wrote to say, do you want to have a look at it before we republish it? And I agonized a little bit, partly thinking,
Are they saying something? Are they
well,
telling
it wasn't that, but it was like, what? I don't think they'd even read it. It was more that I was thinking, what if, first of all, what if I hate it? Or what if I read and think, this guy was quite good in 2006. I wish I could do that. I think, I mean, like, I've got better. It'd be really depressing if I haven't got better. But yeah, it changes. I mean, your experience of all of the things that you have around you in the world influence the way you translate, like they influence the way you write, the way you speak, whatever you've just been reading. I mean, one of the things that I do write about a little bit in the introduction to this is I make a couple of parallels with a Beatles thing and a British actor and whatever, a few things that I was using as analogies, and then kind of catch myself going, but actually, I know why these are the analogies that came to mind, because this British actor just died last week, and so he was on my mind. And actually, I'd just seen the Peter Jackson Get Back Beatles 3-part thing. And of course, that's why that was on my mind. And so quite a lot of the things that I'm aware of, even though as translators, in theory, it's not supposed to be about us, it's supposed to be about someone else. Of course, all of the things that we notice, all the things that we have kind of in front of mind again to influence the way we write. So yes, I
And
sometimes
also,
look back at work
yeah.
and don't recognise where this translation came from even.
And I think the other thing, as you pointed out with the Spanish, that there is no such thing as a single Spanish.
Right.
And there is no such thing as a single English. So, writing for a UK publisher is completely different to a US publisher. And I don't know about you, but I'm often trying to find sort of neutral terms.
Yeah, which we know doesn't really exist, but we sort of pretend it does.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I think increasingly also, at least in my experience, most of the time I'm translating, it may be a publisher in one place or another, but on the whole, that one publisher is going to be trying to find a market everywhere.
Yes.
So I've done a couple of books with Scribe, an Australian publisher. We've done a few books together, and my translation was published in Melbourne, and sold in London, and sold in Detroit, and sold in Auckland, and sold in Dublin. And so you're always aware of the ways in which I can't just say, well, I'm going to be translating this into Melbourne English for my Melbourne readers, and then I'm going to be translating it into Sydney English for these people. They have 800 different editions, because on the whole, you're trying to find a way of
An international English.
yeah, which is never,
Which doesn't.
which is not a real thing.
Yes.
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 So I wanted to ask you if translation theory, ever helped you, or if you ever read it, and in relation to Venuti's domestication and Franization, where do you sit between those two poles, or whether it depends on the book, or whether you have a preference?
I've read very little theory because I didn't really study translation, and I don't know many translators who read theory other than having come through it through study. I recently read a really good book by a British translator and academic called B.J. Woodstein, called Translation Theory for the Practicing Translator, I think, something like that, just published by Anthem Press. And it's B.J.'s way of, she taught translation at the University of East Anglia for a long time, and it's her way of bridging this gap, which I think we all act as though there's absolutely impossible, unbridgeable chasm between us. I found that very interesting as a way of partly her articulating the ideas that happened to be interesting to her in her reading of translation theory, but also articulating the argument for why those things could conceivably be useful to a translator. In my experience, one of the things that I feel like I don't often feel like if only I'd read more theory, I'd be better at this. But I do often feel like I would like to have some language for talking about what I do, which I don't always have, especially when I've been teaching translation. And one of the things that's interesting about writing something like this book or other things I've written about translation is I don't have, I wasn't born knowing the words domestication, foreignization. I've heard of Venuti, but which is already, better than nothing. But that's not. But I don't think in those terms. And part of it is obviously the way I translate. So very, very early on, when my third book, I think, a young translator and student wrote to say she was using one of my translations as the subject of her MA thesis. And I answered some questions, and then she sent me her dissertation, which was fascinating, and I learned a huge amount about what the hell I was doing. And I remember quite early on there being a paragraph that began, Hahn's strategy in whatever, and I was reading this thinking, he really doesn't have a strategy. But of course I do. I mean, I don't have any, or I didn't have any way of articulating it. But there is a way I work and a way I don't work. There are things that I like, and I can make the argument for those things. But that argument is rationalizing after the fact. There's no point at which I go, what this particular book requires is, this is definitely 4.7 on the foreignization scale, this one. I can, with hindsight, look at a book and go, actually, yeah, it's interesting that this one tends to settle a bit more into, in the same way that I don't normally decide like exactly what kind of English I'm going to use. I don't decide like, this is a book which is going to have lots of commas in English. I can look at it again, as I can with any piece of writing, and go, it's interesting that the punctuation has this effect. And I can see how, by choosing to keep this or by choosing to change this, it is a manifestation of some strategy, albeit a non-articulated strategy. I don't feel like there is a huge amount of difference between, especially in terms of that scale we talk about, between one book and the next. I don't think it varies very much because almost all the time what I'm translating not for an academic press almost ever. I'm translating for trade, I'm translating for readers, I'm translating for people who will read this Argentine crime novel in exactly the same way that they would read a Canadian crime novel or a Scottish crime novel. And so because I'm working for publishers who expect their books to be available in Barnes & Noble in the US, whatever it might be, if I were translating for an academic press or a press that was doing classics, maybe, where it is framed in a different way. If the book is a Penguin Classics edition, which has it's in the Penguin Classics livery and footnotes and introduction and endnotes and that sort of thing, that automatically determines certain other decisions. But the great majority of what I'm doing is to be sold in as large numbers as I can manage in bookstores where people buy novels they want to read. And so even though I don't necessarily think in terms of what are the implications of that for the kind of translation I'm making, of course that has implications for the kind of translation I'm making.
So do you do things like, for instance, keep senor, keep calle, certain words which I tend to keep because I want to actually remind the reader reading it in English that this is not actually an English book.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But that's partly to do with setting more than language. That if it was a book written by, I was working on a sample of a Portuguese novel recently which is set in New York, and I'm not going to keep the Portuguese street names just to remind people this novel was written in Portuguese.
No.
If the novel was set in Portugal, I would keep Portuguese street names. But then again, if I was writing an English novel that was set in Portugal, I would also have.
So, are you suggesting that you change the names?
No, but I would.
I mean, writer wrote something, do you change the names according to the countries? You know?
No, I wouldn't normally. It would depend on whether. What I would do normally is I would follow where the book is set. So, if the book is set in Spain and or in
Rio.
yeah, if the book's set in Buenos Aires, I was doing a thing recently, and there's something about the Plaza de Mayo.
Yeah.
I would call it Plaza de Mayo. I wouldn't call it
May Square.
May Square or something.
Oh, right. So yeah.
So you wouldn't call Central Square or whatever Central Park in New York if it's set in New York.
Yeah.
You wouldn't change it to.
Yeah.
Yes. I thought
think
that the
that's what-
contrary, he was
Yeah.
changing.
No, no,
I
no,
thought,
no, no.
okay, right.
No. Okay. That's the question.
Last two questions. Okay, you're allowed to. This one.
I was just I could ask kind of abstract stuff, but I just it's pretty audacious to have done the blog. I was wondering whether you thought about opening it up to comments or whether you did.
You did.
And whether
You did.
You did. And does that drive you mad thinking, oh, I think this, but this person thinks this and this person thinks this?
No, it was great. Thank you for the question. It was one of the things that I really enjoyed having done the blog a couple of times before, and one of the reasons I wanted to do it again was because I was publishing them. I was publishing it in real time, so it's different now because it's the novel is published. This thing is published. It's like it's too late now. You can't help me now. But there was a point at which I would say, the post would be, here is this problem. I have a few different options, or maybe there's something I haven't even thought about. And people did kind of weigh in and suggest things and say, I like your solution, or have you thought about that maybe? And so when I said that this is almost verbatim as it appears on the blog, the almost is because I incorporated some of
Yes,
the comments.
some of them are actually.
So what happens is things that appeared below the line, comments below the line on the blog, here there's a little post saying, I got a comment from, Vineet commented on the post and he suggested the following thing. So there are a few people who weighed in at various points, which is it's very companionable, in this slightly weird inside your head thing we're doing, to have someone who's kind of looking over your shoulder going, that's quite nice. Maybe you've thought about that. That doesn't really work, does it?
Or
You didn't
you
have
just
trolls
solved
going,
something
terrible.
for my translation. I mean,
Yeah, that's the
of course
thing.
that's- yeah.
Quite a few of the people who commented were translators, but also some of them were people who are not translators, kind of going,
So that's
wow,
what you do.
what a weird job you do.
Okay, last question.
The question is, does translation affect the original text? And I give you a couple of examples. I've been at a session where an author got up and had some facility in both the language, obviously, in which he was writing, and also the language into which it was translated. But she didn't do the translation. She made the comment that the book actually was better in English when she read it in English. She found it more satisfying reading it in English than how she'd written it. You made a comment just before about how the French translation of a book cleared up some problems that there had been due to, and different countries definitely have different styles of editing. They edit books in very different ways. And
Or
so
not at all.
the translations sometimes come up against problems that the original... and I guess the third comment that sort of impinges on this is great books. Let's talk about Shakespeare. Has been translated into all sorts of different languages, but those and many of those languages consider Shakespeare as great a playwright as the English consider him. But do they look at him in the same way? Do they get the same stuff from the translation as the original English? And does that matter? I mean, it doesn't matter, but how does that impact back?
I mean, those are really interesting questions. I'll just say something about Shakespeare really briefly because I'm writing a book about Shakespeare in translation at the moment, which is another thing which I'm supposed to be doing, which I'm not in fact doing because I'm having an evening with you, which is much more fun. And then it's really interesting to look at as you say, the huge numbers of translations of Shakespeare, and those translations themselves are often sort of canonical. Those translations feel like they're part of, in the same way that lots of things that I have read in English translation feel like they're part of my literature, even if I happen not to read the source. And Shakespeare's like the extreme example of this because there is so much of it. There are so many translations, and there are lots of languages that will have 100 Romeo and Juliet translations over the last, 400 years. The question of how translations affect originals is a really interesting one, and I think there are some very concrete ways and some slightly less concrete ways. The concrete ways are, if I fix a mistake, that will get fixed when that book is reprinted in that other language, in the original language. They will hopefully not have that mistake. And that goes passed on to other translations. Those things quite concretely, things that I change might be reflected back into the original. But also I think there are writers who think about their translations when they write. There are writers who think about their translators when they write. There are writers who, I think, like to cause trouble for their translators. They do very deliberately do things that make our lives difficult. And in a sense, the translation, like the awareness that this is going to have to be, like, at some point Danny's going to have to translate this into English. It'll be really funny if I put another poem in. Those things, there are, with the writers I've worked with a lot, there are in-jokes in the originals for me to get 3 years later when I come around to translating the book. Because actually a lot of the time, if you're lucky enough to work with a writer on more than one book, sometimes it's quite a long-term, quite an intimate, relationship you have with them. And there are also, I think, a lot of writers who have the habit of working sufficiently closely with their translators. I remember commissioning a story from Valeria Luiselli a few years ago, a great Mexican writer, who now writes largely in English, but she was originally writing in Spanish, translated by Cristina McSweeney. And I remember commissioning this story from her and writing to her and saying, I know Cristina hasn't translated it, but can I have the Spanish in the meantime just to read it so I can see? And she wrote and said something like, the Spanish won't be absolutely fixed until the translation has been done. Because she got feedback and she saw what worked in English, and then she kind of went back to Spanish when actually, that is a little bit, that could be slightly shaped differently. And that's the thing that wasn't, it's not that it was, published in Spanish, absolutely fixed, crystallized, unchangeable, and then it gets passed on. This is a thing that is still quite malleable at the point at which it's being translated, and therefore it is possible for those two things to, for the translator's fingerprints to be in the original a little bit as well.
Could you please join me in thanking Daniel?
Thank you.